We all know who Michael Jordan is, what he accomplished on the court, what he accomplished off the court, the accessories, the characteristics, and the jersey, whether it was the name on the back or the city on the front. Michael Jordan turned the Chicago Bulls from a temperate 20-year-old expansion team in the Midwest's largest market to a global brand synonymous with one man and a basketball franchise made familiar with success at the highest level for an entire generation of hoop fans during a time where the NBA saw exponential growth and influence. It was all Jordan. Over 25 years later, the Chicago Bulls are a shell of the on-court product when Mike last donned the red and black. However, the franchise has still maintained relevance because of the 90s. They are still the sixth most valuable franchise in the NBA, worth over $5 billion, despite not reaching the Eastern Conference Finals since 2011 and not making the playoffs for 7 of their last 9 seasons. The Bulls will always have those 6 NBA championship trophies, and they could never be taken away. And the Jordan faithful would never let you forget them. In turn, the legend of Michael Jordan will always allow the Bulls to retain cultural and financial relevance in the NBA, no matter how pathetic or mediocre the on-court product continues to be. During and even after his playing career, it seemed like anything Michael Jordan touched turned to gold. He was basketball's King Midas. Even when he was away from the game, he was making blockbuster films and was on every other commercial. You just couldn't truly fail if you had Jordan on your side. But there was one instance, one NBA Twilight Zone scenario, one where Mike sacrificed his folklore-esque legacy and image to play 142 games years after his one-of-one storybook career came to a close for one of the most unimpressive and poorly ran franchises in league history, and everyone was worse for it. Let's review the what, when, why, and how of Michael Jordan's 2 seasons as a Washington Wizard.
And the celebration can begin in Washington.
And here's his opposite. Look at this. Minute Bowl, 7 feet 5.
I'm a rookie, yes. The Bullets drafted Rasheed 4th overall in 1995, but he and Weber.
Washington Wizards got the new unis, got the new name.
Michael Jordan makes it official and says he is indeed coming back to the game he loves.
But first, we have to dive into the Wizards. How did they get to the franchise we know them as today? Well, we'll have to go back to 1961, where, ironically, the team was born in a city that came upon Michael Jordan differently, Chicago, Illinois. The franchise destined to call the district its home started as the Chicago Packers. In response to the rivaling ABL establishing the Chicago Majors in the same year, the Packers were born and named after the prominent meatpacking industry in the city. Of course, this drew ire from the folks of Chicago, with the name identical to that of their bitter NFL rivals, the Green Bay Packers. Due to that, the team would swiftly rebrand to the Chicago Zephyrs, a reference to the Greek god Zephyrus, the personification of the West Wind, an apt name for the Midwestern capital, colloquially known as the Windy City. However, the Zephyrs only lived for a single season before the team was moved 700 miles east to the Mid-Atlantic, Baltimore, Maryland to be specific. In Baltimore, the franchise would be named the Baltimore Bullets, a moniker for the DMV-based franchise that would remain for the next 34 years. As the newly named Bullets, the team would storm onto the NBA scene within its first decade in Baltimore behind drafting Hall of Fame talent like Earl the Pearl Monroe and Wes Unseld. In 7 of their first 10 seasons in Charm City, the Bullets would make the postseason, including winning the Eastern Conference for the franchise's first hardware in 1971, ultimately losing to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and his Milwaukee Bucks in the NBA Finals. For nearly the entirety of the 70s, the Bullets were perennial contenders in the NBA. After an unimpressive 38-win season as the reigning Eastern Conference champs, Baltimore acquired Elvin Hayes from Houston, where he would become an integral star for the team for the next 9 seasons. Following their finals loss in 71, they would make the second round for 3 straight postseasons before losing in the finals again in 1975, this time to Rick Barry in Golden State. 3 years later, it would become clear that the third time was in fact the charm. Now in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Landover, Maryland, The Bullets were the Capital Bullets for a season before settling on formally representing Washington. Despite winning just 48 games, the Bullets would go on to win the East yet again, where they would meet the Seattle Supersonics in the 1978 NBA Finals. It would be a very competitive 7-game series, with each game besides Game 5 being decided by 8 points or fewer. It would be the Bullets who would come out on top in Game 7, and the franchise would earn its first and only NBA championship in their 15th season in the DMV. In the subsequent season after their title, the Bullets would go 54-28 and take down the Hawks, and then vanquish the Spurs after a legendary 7-game comeback on their way back to the championship game, where they would find themselves in a rematch with the Sonics. With a chip on their shoulder and looking to avenge the season prior, where they had come just short, Seattle handedly defeated Washington and won their only title in franchise history. It would be the last time DC would advance to the NBA Finals. In fact, it would be the last time the franchise that we would soon come to know as the Wizards would even appear in the Eastern Conference Finals. An aging core and a plague of injuries would slowly wither away the roster that won in '78. They would miss the playoffs for the first time in 13 years in 1981, where Unseld would retire at 34 years old that offseason, and Elvin Hayes would be dealt back to the Rockets in the season that followed. Throughout the 80s, the Washington Bullets melted into a mediocre franchise, failing to win more than 43 games in a season during the decade. They were constantly a rotating door, in and out of the first round of the playoffs, and only put together 5 winning seasons in that span. Instead of bringing in superstar talent, the Bullets came upon the likes of Manute Bol and Muggsy Bogues in the 1985 and 87 drafts respectively, the tallest and shortest players in the league at the time, and the team would often utilize a sideshow-esque marketing strategy to draw a crowd to see the two players during an unimpressive stretch in the team's on-court output. As the league stormed into the 90s, Washington would stay as an afterthought in the NBA. The team would finish with 30 or fewer wins on the season 6 times that decade, and the only highlight was a 44-win season in 1997, where they slid into the first round for the first time in 9 years during a year where they had 3 separate head coaches on record. The franchise would consistently come around quality talent, mostly in the draft due to their lack of success on the court. Washington would bring in the likes of Tom Gugliotta, Juwan Howard, Chris Webber, and Rasheed Wallace. Yet injuries would dampen the impact of a majority of the incoming talent, and most were shipped away from the team to make lateral moves. On May 15, 1997, the team would officially retire the Bullets moniker and become the Washington Wizards. This change was made due to the owner's belief that the Bullets name didn't mesh well with the violent implications of guns and the high crime rate in the DC area. The team moved into their current home at MCI Center, now known as Capital One Arena, that same year, and under a new name and look, the team was aiming to reroute towards building the foundation to return to the competitive nature they held in the 70s. Unfortunately, that is not what would transpire. Despite rifling off a winning record for their inaugural season in Chinatown, the Wizards would lose Chris Webber due to an infamous clash with Don Nelson and would stumble to 18 wins during the lockout-shortened 1998-99 season. They would go 48-116 in the 2 seasons thereafter, but a famous and familiar face would step in amid that stretch entering the new millennium. June 14th, 1998, at Delta Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. Michael Jordan would play his final game as a Chicago Bull and conclude by winning his 6th and final championship in cinematic fashion. January 13th, 1999, 7 months after his last professional game, Jordan would officially retire from the NBA for a second time. He said that he was 99.9% certain he would never play in the NBA again. He said that he was at peace with the decision and had accomplished everything he could as an individual. He said he wanted to spend more time with his family. He said he had felt he lost the drive and desire to continue playing. He said it was a good time to hang up his shoes. Michael was 36 years old at this point. It was a natural and optimal sunset for the most prolific player the league had witnessed. Many would have imagined he would just kick back and generate endless wealth from his endorsements. Jordan Brand was only 2 years old and was already set to be the athleisure, sneaker culture-oriented empire it is known as today. Everything MJ was expressing was towards the notion that he would finally let himself rest and fully step away from the game of basketball. But Michael Jordan was also a well-known psychopath who was addicted to the game, among other things. By January of the following year, Jordan had already resurfaced in the National Basketball Association, not as a player, but as a member of the front office. In fact, Michael would assume the role of president of basketball operations, not for the Chicago Bulls or even his hometown Charlotte Hornets, a team he would later become the majority owner of for 13 years, but for the Washington Wizards. Effective on January 19, 2000, it was part of the deal for Jordan's role in purchasing a minority stake in the team that same month. Michael Jordan would only hold this front office role for a season and a half, and his track record was far from desirable. He only made 14 moves during his executive tenure, including 6 trades and 2 draft selections. When he took over the helm, he was pretty cold towards the incumbent coach, Gar Heard, who had only been leading the team for roughly 45 games and won 14 upset games before Jordan dismissed him. This would be Mike's first official move, 11 days into his new position, and he would replace Heard with Darren Walker, a former player for Washington who had recently coached the Raptors for a year and a half with a poor 41-90 record. He had been coaching in the CBA, where his team was in last place when he got the call to join the Wizards. He believed he was going to join as an assistant, but the deal that was on the table for Golden State assistant Rod Higgins, Jordan's friend and golfing pal, fell through and Washington hastily moved forward. Walker would coach out the rest of that 99-2000 season with a record of 15-23. He would be dismissed from the role that summer and replaced by Leonard Hamilton, a tenured collegiate coach who had recently built up the program at Miami. He would win 19 games with DC and be promptly fired as well. During that 19-win season, the marquee moment for President Jordan was arguably the singular net positive move he made in that role, cleaning the Wizards' hands of Juwan Howard's contract. Howard was in the midst of a 7-year, $105 million deal where his contract was cap-consuming for Washington and seen as untradeable in consensus. Howard was underperforming throughout the length of his contract, and despite picking up his play in the 54 games he appeared in for the Wizards that year, with 18, 7-3, the fans and front office alike were ready to move on. Jordan traded the 27-year-old Howard to the Mavericks in a package for the return headlined by 31-year-old Christian Laettner. While it wasn't exactly a difference maker for the Wizards, it staved off the negative reception Jordan was getting as he worked to get the roster under the cap. Moving to the 2001 offseason, we of course have to address the shining turd of Jordan's executive career, the 2001 NBA Draft, a draft where the Washington franchise received only their 3rd #1 pick in franchise history. In a class containing bigs the likes of Tyson Chandler, Pau Gasol, and Zach Randolph, and that's just the bigs, Jordan set his sights on Kwame Brown. The 19-year-old would become the first player in NBA history to be drafted straight out of high school first overall, and to Jordan's credit, he was highly touted and expected to be the first off the board in many mock drafts. Nevertheless, Brown would become arguably the most infamous draft bust in NBA history. He would only play 94 games in DC, averaging 7 points and 5 rebounds on 45% from the field in 22 minutes a night before being shipped away, becoming a journeyman for the 6 other teams he would suit up for throughout his 12-year professional career. By the end of the 2001 offseason, Jordan had seemingly fatigued himself of the difficult task of building up the Wizards, and the months of him making cheeky hints, smiles, and winks to the fans and media alike had finally reached a boiling point. Combined with the state of the nation following the September 11th attacks, Michael Jordan would make a pronounced and charitable re-entrance onto the NBA hardwood. On September 25, 2001, Jordan would formally announce his intent to sign with the Wizards as a player, signing a 2-year, $2 million deal in which he would donate his first year's salary to the victims of 9/11. In doing this, Jordan had to put a pause on his executive role, as well as sell his minority stake in the team. His first head coach since Phil Jackson would be another familiar face for Mike, Doug Collins. The same Doug Collins who led the Bulls as a young Jordan quickly rose into a bona fide superstar in the late 80s. Michael would make his dramatic return to the NBA on October 30th, 2001, where the Wizards would open their season in Manhattan, playing the Knicks in the world-famous Madison Square Garden. Washington would only lose by a basket, but it would be a glimpse towards the season to come. The Wizards would start the year 2-8 in their first 10. The roster was less than ideal, and besides the 38-year-old Jordan averaging an inefficient 23 a night, the only other reliable spark on offense was a 23-year-old Richard Hamilton with 20 points per game, also on rough efficiency. The Wizards' season was a noble effort at most. Aside from an emphatic December where DC went 11-4 and Collins won Coach of the Month honors, the team was below average. They were one of the slowest teams in the NBA while managing a bottom 10 defense and a middle-of-the-pack offense. The offense aspect was impressive since it was simply Old Man Mike and Baby Rip out there reliably. However, by the time the Wizards reached their final stretch of the year post-All-Star, the team's postseason hopes would collapse. It all tied back to Jordan. Just as the Wizards were rolling as Mike caught his stride in December, climaxed by him scoring a combined 96 points over a 2-game stretch in the final days of 2001, the team took a nosedive as Jordan struggled to meet the physical demands of the second half of the season as he battled a chronic knee injury, missing 12 games between February 27th and March 18th. By the time he returned, his play was some of the worst of his career, scoring less than 10 points in 3 of the final 7 games he suited for that season. He would be shut down after putting up just 1 basket in 12 minutes against the Lakers on April 2nd, and his first season as a Wizard would conclude unceremoniously. With the team finishing 37-45, they would place 10th in the East and fall 5 games short of making the playoffs. In the 2002 offseason, Wes Unseld and Michael Jordan, off the record, focused on retooling and making marginal improvements to the Wizards roster to break into the playoffs for the first time since 1997. They would trade the young Rip Hamilton in a package to Detroit in exchange for a few players, including Jerry Stackhouse, a 28-year-old bucket hunter who was 2 seasons removed from averaging nearly 30 points a night for the Pistons. DC would bring in Larry Hughes, who was previously with Golden State. Teams were generating interest in Hughes going back to his 32-game stretch after being traded from Philadelphia to the Warriors in 2000, where he averaged 22.7 points a night at just 21 years old. Jordan prioritized working on his health and preparing his body to withstand a full season. Going into the year, he even vouched to start the season in a 6-man role to mediate his knee problems. In those games off the bench, Mike averaged 16, 3, and 2 with 1.6 steals a game on 48% from the field in 28 minutes. However, a mix of numerous injuries on the roster and lackluster play led to Jordan's return to the starting lineup. Jordan would make it his mission to reinvigorate the Wizards season, but in all aspects, it was too little, too late. As for the team, there was still just about zero offense aside from Stackhouse, who averaged a team-high 21.5 points a night in 70 games that year. Washington had the same bottom 10 offense and the same below-average defense, despite Michael Jordan at 40 years of age managing to be the only player on the team that season to suit up and play all 82 games. The Wizards would find themselves facing the same results as the year prior: 37-45, 9th seed, and missing the postseason by 5 games. The bright spot of the year was the theatrics and ceremony around Jordan's 14th All-Star selection, the last All-Star game of his career. Michael Jordan would play the final NBA game of his career on April 16, 2003. In Philadelphia against the Sixers, Mike scored 15 points on 15 shots as DC was routed in a 20-point blowout by the hands of Allen Iverson's competitive team. Following the season, Jordan's contract would expire and he was expected to return to his position in the front office, but to the surprise of many, including Mike himself, he would instead be fired by majority owner Abe Pollin. Pollin justified Jordan's release by reflecting back on his track record both in office and on the court and how it impacted the team, promoting the benching of Larry Hughes for Tyronn Lue, handling poor trades the previous season, and most pronounced, using the team's first overall pick on a high schooler. He would be replaced by Ernie Grunfeld, and his 3.5-year relationship with the franchise would come to a dramatic conclusion, closing a bizarre, unnecessary, and questionable final chapter in the story of whom many consider to be the greatest to ever do it. So this leads us back to the main question, and perhaps the extended title for this video. Why did the game's greatest player risk his legacy to play for the league's most lukewarm franchise? The short answer is that he still had a passion for basketball, and he felt he could compete at a high level, combined with the inspiration that he wanted to prove he could still play and lead a struggling team. Due to his prior influence on the franchise as a part owner and president of basketball ops, he wanted to mold his own team and then lead by example. Most effective of all, it was expected that a return to the court would cause a return to the highs of the NBA's ratings, merchandise sales, and his personal brand. Interestingly enough, the TV ratings never recovered from the mid-90s and would continue to decline for the 2 decades that followed. After his time in DC, Jordan would pivot to buy a majority stake in his hometown Hornets, who were still known as the Bobcats in 2010. As for the Wizards, the years following Jordan's involvement would rarely show signs of life. A miserable 03-04 season, as the team recoiled from the NJ whirlwind, would produce a new core of Gilbert Arenas, a rejuvenated Larry Hughes under new coach Eddie Jordan, no relation, and Antoine Jameson. The Arenas era of the Wizards would cultivate in winning seasons from 2005 to 2008, where the team would only go as far as the Eastern Conference semis. In the seasons that followed, the franchise would suffer as Arenas struggled to recover from knee operations and then subsequently would spoil the team's 2009-2010 season due to an infamous firearm scandal that led to the dissolution of the team's core. This return to the bottom of the NBA gifted the Wizards with another #1 pick, and instead of a high schooler, they picked a viral, high-flying guard from Kentucky, John Wall. Wall would place second in Rookie of the Year voting behind an impressive 16-8 in his first professional season, and he would quickly phase out Arenas in Washington. The franchise would draft players in the lottery like Bradley Beal out of Florida and Otto Porter Jr. out of Georgetown, as well as key signings like Marcin Gortat and Paul Pierce. Soon enough, John Wall had a roster around him competent enough to bring DC back to the postseason, and in all sincerity, it would be the most successful the franchise had been since their championship competing years in the 70s. Between 2014 and 2018, Washington would make the playoffs 4 times. This includes a 41-win season in 2017, the most wins in a year since 1977, when the Wizards took part in an electric 7-game series against the Boston Celtics. Unfortunately, the team would fall just 1 win short of their first ECF appearance in 38 years. In late 2018, John Wall suffered a torn Achilles, which would change the trajectory of both his career and the future of the Wizards franchise. It would ultimately conclude his tenure in Washington and place the team in its current state. Bill became a star in his own right and would linger on the roster long enough to secure an enormous Supermax contract, made notorious by a no-trade clause, finally moving on in 2023 to join the Phoenix Suns. Since that last playoff appearance with Wall, the Wizards have failed to win more than 35 games in a season. In fact, in the last 2 seasons as of the recording of this video, Washington has a record of 24-109. This season, they were on pace to win even fewer than the 15 wins they managed to get last season. Aside from an outlier year where an exiled Russell Westbrook snuck the team into the 8th seed, the Wizards have been completely irrelevant and true bottom feeders in the NBA for the past few years. To make a terrible situation catastrophic, the franchise has been far from proficient in the draft in the years following Wall. With the 3 lottery picks that they've owned since 2019, DC took Rui Hachimura, Johnny Davis, and most recently, Alex Sarr with the 2nd overall pick in the 2024 draft. Salvation could indeed be on the way, but the current management has not given much confidence that the seasons to follow will go in their favor. Washington has not seen the mountaintop in a very, very long time. They have made mistakes and mismanagements, and have fallen victim to some of the common pitfalls that come about in the NBA. They are not a large market team or a renowned sports brand, and they are often an afterthought in the minds of casual sport consumers. That is what makes it truly fascinating that a player larger than life, more accomplished than most, and a global icon had even intersected with a franchise like that. Even if it was only for 142 games, Michael Jordan was a Washington Wizard. And if it proved anything above anything else, it reiterated the fact that the bald-headed anomaly who didn't even make his varsity team until junior year really, really loved the game of basketball. Thank you for watching.